Hello everyone. Sorry about that delay. There's like some glitches coming on here on my screen. It's an absolute pleasure to join you again here on the Vitality Show and to share a little bit about my holiday fare, because people have been asking me, what do you eat on the holidays? People associate holidays as being times of really special food and particularly expensive high-end food. So that for most people means meat. There are people who eat plant-based only during the week, or mostly plant-based during the week, but then they're like, oh, but on the Sabbath, if they're Jewish, or during Christmas and Thanksgiving, how can you not have your turkey? How can you not have your roasted lamb or pig or whatever it is? Meat is really the center of what is considered a good quality, high-end, fancy meal. So how is it that I can cook and be a foodie and make gourmet food and have festive meals if I'm not using animal products? How on earth do I do that? And that's a really good question, because to be honest, growing up, meat was definitely of high prominence at all of our holiday gatherings. I grew up in a family where salad is actually really important. My sisters and I would fight over the salad and who got the most. And my dad happens to be a really phenomenal salad chef. That being said, there was always meat at the table. And if it wasn't meat, there was going to be a quiche, or there was going to be cheese, or some sort of animal product of some sort, fish, chicken, whatever it is. Definitely had to hold a place of high prominence at family meals, but particularly holiday meals. So I can totally relate to this thing of like, what do? You can't have meat and potatoes and a salad and then just remove the meat and just have potatoes and salad. I actually had a friend of mine once tell me that she tried going plant-based. She got really inspired. She tried going plant-based and found herself hungry all the time. And my immediate reaction was, let me guess. You think carbohydrates are bad for you because you're hearing all this anti-carb stuff in the media, and you don't know anything about beans. So you're eating all salad all day and you're starving. And she's like, yeah, how did you know? And I said, because that's so typical of what's happening, particularly in the West, where people are hearing a lot of hype that isn't supported by data and research. And they're confounding and confusing multiple different things. So for example, carbohydrates is not the same thing as candy bar, right? So there's candy bar, there's whole grain bread, there's bananas, there's potatoes, there's beans, and root vegetables. All of these things are carbohydrates, and they are not the same thing. You can't compare McDonald's French fries to a roasted potato in the oven, right? They're not the same thing. You can't compare a candy bar to a banana. Yes, this has sugar. Yes, this has sugar. Not the same thing, right? Candy bar is what Michael Pollan would call a food-like substance, right? And a banana is food. And so we just have to make sure that we're not confounding certain terms like carbohydrates and just saying like, oh, all this stuff is bad. Rather saying there's food, there's whole foods, and then there's processed foods. Sometimes processed foods are fat. Sometimes they're protein. Sometimes they're, salt or sugar or carbohydrate. And sometimes they're a funky combination of all of those. Nonetheless, processed food just tends not to be good for us because it's gone through a very chemicalized, nasty process where they take most of the good stuff out so that the food can sit on a shelf for a really long time. But the food that's really good for you can't sit on the shelf for very long. And that's true, except for a certain category of food, and that is seeds. Seeds have a very long shelf life. That means seeds of legumes like beans and lentils and chickpeas and a lot of nuts, if they've been dried and cured well, they can also have a long shelf life. And the seeds of any plants, right? If you take apple seeds and you put them on the counter and you allow them to dry all the way, you could plant them a year later and end up with an apple tree. That's also true for broccoli seeds or for dandelion seeds. Seeds are designed to not break down easily. And the reason is they have chemicals that are really difficult to digest just naturally. Seeds just naturally have these compounds. It's not like they're put on there by Monsanto or something like that. These are just natural compounds that are existing in seeds that are called anti-nutrients. They actually make people and bugs and animals feel bad when they eat them. And the purpose of that is to kind of keep them away so that the seed can end up germinating in the ground and not get eaten before it gets there. So you'll notice birds, for example, are really notable for propagating seeds. And the reason that is because they'll eat a fruit and they'll poop out the seed totally whole. They can't digest the seed. It's difficult for them. It gives them a stomach ache. So they'll just poop the seed out whole somewhere else in nature. And that allows that plant to have seeds in lots of different places, right? There's lots of different ways that plants get their seeds spread around. If you think of a dandelion, you just blow on it and you get seeds going everywhere. But the seeds inside of a fruit are only going to spread through the animals that eat the fruit and then poop the seeds out whole. And that's how the seeds end up somewhere else in nature, and you get lots of different trees of, let's say, apple trees or something like that. Okay, but in any case, why is that important to know? It's important to know because it means that you have very easily accessible in your pantry a whole bunch of seeds that are incredibly chock full of nutrients because they have all the nutrients that a plant needs to begin its entire life. And it also has a very stable shelf life, which means that you can keep it for a long time until you're ready to use it. And it's also really just darn good for you. Okay, so take, for example, a chickpea. You can take dried chickpeas, buy them from the store, and leave them on your shelf for a really long time. Mind you, the longer you wait, the harder they are to cook, the harder they are to plant. So ideally, you want to use them as close to the purchase as you can, but you can have them on your shelf for a few months and it's fine, right? So you buy chickpeas and they sit on your shelf, and when you soak them overnight, you begin the germination process. You begin the same process that would start if you took that seed and put it in the soil. But it's easier actually if it starts in water. So you soak that seed overnight and you're actually sprouting the seed. And if you give it even more time, eventually you're going to see it starts to grow a tail. You'll notice this very quickly happening with lentils, for example. You can see the tail of a lentil in just 24 hours of soaking. With chickpeas, it takes a little bit longer, but not that much longer. And once it starts building that tail, that's the beginning of that plant going towards roots and leaves and roots, so it can start a whole new plant. And so literally this totally dead, not dead, but this dormant seed that's been sitting on the shelf for a really long time that no bugs really want to eat because it's so difficult to digest because it's got all these anti-nutrients that make the nutrients inside the chickpea inaccessible to us. As soon as we put the chickpea in water and let it soak overnight, a remarkable change happens, and we're able to actually access the nutrients in the chickpea. Even more so if we go ahead and cook that chickpea, we kill all of those anti-nutrients and we're left with rich fiber and protein and tons of minerals and vitamins that are really good for us. And we're also left with a food that is not just incredibly inexpensive, but also super filling, and that has so much flexibility in what you can do with it. You can make incredible stews and curries and meatloaves and burgers and we make homemade hummus, right? Or hummus, as some people like to say, with chickpeas, for example. We make curry stews of lots of different types of curries, from Thai to Indian to Jamaican. We'll make like a Moroccan stew with chickpeas. There's so many things that you can do, and that's for me what I do to replace where meat used to sit at the centerpiece of a meal. For us, it's usually a bean dish. And beans are incredibly versatile, where you can, just like meat is versatile, there's lots of different things you can do with it, but also beans are very satiating. So I happen to love salad. I've mentioned this many times. I'm salad obsessed. I could eat salad all day. But salad doesn't have that kind of satiating experience that you get from hearty, starchy, fiber-rich beans or root vegetables. So within any given meal, even if I'm eating a ton of salad, you'll also see me having something a little bit denser and more hearty that's going to sustain me for longer, and then I'm not going to just like pee out an hour later like I would with a salad that's just vegetables. So so that's where the beans come in, and I'm just going to share with you an idea of like how we present a holiday meal in our home. So the first thing we do is we make our homemade sourdough bread. And if you go to my YouTube channel, and my YouTube is Chana Mason Vitality Coach, you'll find 2 different videos on how to make sourdough bread. They're not the best videos ever, but they're good enough. And people have definitely used them to learn how to make sourdough bread and to understand how sourdough functions, which is why the videos are pretty long, despite the fact that in our home, it takes us 5 to 10 minutes to make sourdough bread. Kid you not, that's it. Then we pop the dough into the oven, and in the morning, we just press start and get the baking going. We don't have to work it. It's really simple bread to make. So I highly recommend you check out how to make sourdough bread because it's incredibly easy to digest and it's nourishing and satiating. And we use whole grain spelt and we put some flax meal into our sourdough. So in Jewish tradition, we always have bread at festive meals. So we make sure to make our sourdough bread, and that's part of our meal. And I also like to make lots of different kinds of salads. I want the rainbow expressed on my Sabbath table or on my festive holiday table. And what that means is that I'll make a beet salad and a carrot salad and a cucumber salad and a roasted vegetable salad, depending on what vegetables are in season. Like right now, zucchini and onions are really great, peppers maybe, or fennel when it's in season. So I'll make like a roasted veggie platter or roasted veggie salad. And I usually have some sort of leafy green, cabbage, tomato. I make each of these salads separately. And the reason I do that is partly because it looks pretty and partly because I notice some people like tomatoes and some people don't. Me, don't like tomatoes, but my husband really likes tomatoes. My son doesn't like beets very much, but we love them a ton. And so it just allows each person to pick like, okay, what are the vegetables that they want on their plate? What are the vegetables they don't want on their plate without things getting slimy and intermixed all over the place? But it also creates an experience of abundance to have so many different kinds of salads on the table. And then I make what in Hebrew we call salatim, which are like the little salads, like dip things that work really nicely with bread. So we make a homemade hummus. So when I cook chickpeas, I usually cook about 1 kilo, which is a little over 2 pounds of chickpeas at a time. And then I freeze it into batches, and we use the batches for lots of different things. I make chickpea brownies, I'll make hummus, or I'll make some of these core main dishes that I was talking about. But to make hummus, we just take chickpeas and tahina and fresh herbs and spices, garlic. Sometimes I'll put roasted sweet potato, roasted onion into it just to give it a little extra kick, or roasted peppers if you want, which is my favorite, but that might be something people would enjoy. And you go ahead and throw those all into a food processor or a blender and let it go until it gets nice and creamy. And you have to see how much liquid you're going to add depending on the consistency of the hummus that you like, and obviously salt to taste. Great. So that's one of the dippy salad things that we have with our bread. We also make a homemade tahina. And in the tahina, I put tons and tons and tons of chopped parsley. So I've mentioned before that leafy greens are super duper good for you. One of the leafy greens that people totally ignore are herbs. And herbs are so delicious. In Israel, they happen to be incredibly inexpensive and grow in massive abundance. So it's so fun to take parsley, which is, you can see by its color how rich it is in chlorophyll, which is also a reflection of how many nutrients it has in it. And it's very cleansing and really good for you. Chock full of protein, chock full of vitamins and minerals. Chop that thing up really, really fine and mix it up with my tahina. That's another dip that I'll do. Usually I'll make some sort of cream, either a pesto cream or a macadamia garlic cream or a cheesy kind of dip, depending on my mood. And what other dippy things do I do? Oh, a lot of times I make, without any oil, sauteed onions and mushrooms. And we serve that hot to be eaten on top of the hummus. And if you've never had that, oh my gosh, it's so good. Okay. What else do we do? As far as dips, sometimes I'll make a sun-dried tomato dip or an olive tapenade. There's lots of different dips that you can have with bread. If you think about what are the types of spreads they sell at sandwich shops to go onto bread, and you can be creative in that way. You can use nuts to make things really creamy. So for example, when I said I make a pesto, how do I make pesto without oil? Really good question. One of the things that I used to do was make pesto with a lot of oil, and I noticed that the olive oil cut the bitterness in the basil. Basil's really bitter. If you've never had a basil leaf straight, it's kind of strong. It has a rich, pungent taste, which is absolutely fantastic, but it can be bitter. And I noticed that the olive oil cuts the bitterness in the basil, but if I'm not going to use olive oil, how am I going to cut the bitterness in the basil? So I have a few options. One is I don't use that much basil and I use a ton of nuts and make it really creamy. You can use pine nuts or macadamia nuts or cashews. If you want to go less expensive, you can use walnuts or sunflower seeds, although I don't like the flavor as much, and I happen to be allergic to walnuts and don't particularly like sunflower seeds. So those are the picks in my house. The other thing that you can do is if you don't want the dip to be too fatty, which is something that I've mentioned many times before, we want to keep our fat intake low, less than 10% of our diet. What I do is I'll throw in a zucchini. So just yesterday, we had a family pizza movie night, and I made a macadamia cheese, like a cream to put on the pizza. And in with the macadamia nuts, I put some shiitake mushrooms and I put a whole zucchini. And you don't taste the zucchini at all, but what it does is it's very creamy and it's thickening and it's got kind of a sliminess to it. So it makes it nice and thick and creamy without any flavor, and it lowers the percentage of fat in the cream itself. So that's a cool trick that you can do. And you're still the question of how do you cut the bitterness in the basil? And my answer to that is really funny. I'll put either sun-dried tomatoes or raisins into the pesto, and it makes the pesto just like a little bit sweeter, but people seem to like it, and I like it too, and it's great. So that's my secret to how I cut the bitterness in the basil, because sweet kind of counteracts bitter. So there you go. So we make lots of dippy things. We make tons of salads. Usually by the time the salad course is done, most people are almost full, but you know, it's a festive meal, so we want to put more stuff out. So this is what I do. I usually have in my mind always a vegetable, a starch, like a grain, sorry, and a main course. So for me, the vegetable is going to be roasted sweet potato or squash or pumpkin or something like that, or I'll make a pumpkin pie, or if it's in season, maybe like broccoli or cauliflower or asparagus, something like that, but usually kind of a hearty vegetable. As a grain, I'll make quinoa. A really fun quinoa that I like to make is I put the quinoa in the pan and I toast it. And then I add whatever requisite water is required, 2 parts water, 1 part quinoa, depending on how much quinoa you're making, and salt to taste. And then I'll put shredded coconut and either powdered cinnamon or a cinnamon stick into the pan. And it creates this super creamy, delicious, surprising flavor. People aren't used to having cinnamon and coconut in their grains, but I actually grew up with that. In Colombia, we have like a coconut rice that my mother would spend hours making, and I just make it kind of the easy version by just putting shredded coconut. Although my mother's, of course, is always better. Okay, and then so do rice or quinoa or buckwheat or I'm trying to think of what other grains we use. Amaranth. Different, whatever grain speaks to you. And then I'll do a bean-based main course. Lately, I've really been enjoying making quiche. And I'm going to share that recipe because it's chock full of things you would never, ever expect to hear about. So here we go. Into my quiche, I'll put a ton of vegetables. And it just depends on what vegetables are in season, what vegetables you like. Lately, we've been doing zucchini, mushroom, and greens, either kale or Swiss chard, and tons of onions. I don't bother cooking them first. I just throw them all into a huge bowl. Then I find whatever fresh herbs are in my garden, or sometimes I use tarragon, which I'm not growing fresh, but I happen to be obsessed with. So I'll throw that in, or whatever fresh herbs I feel like throwing in, and obviously salt to taste. Okay, and then how do I make the normal like egg and cheese mixture? So I'm not using eggs and I'm not using cheese. So what am I doing? Into the blender, I throw tofu, nutritional yeast or brewer's yeast. Sometimes I'll put mushrooms or a little bit of shiitake, which has like a very strong taste, or a little bit of porcini mushroom or a little bit of truffle if I have. But like a lot of nutritional yeast, so it gets like a really nice cheesy taste. The other thing, if I have it, is I'll add aquafaba. So aquafaba is the water that's left over from cooking chickpeas. And if you cook it down until it gets really thick, you end up with something that functions just like egg. So I'll throw aquafaba into the blender, and then I'll also throw in either chickpea flour or lentil flour also into the blender. And it all blends up into this very creamy mixture. I put that in the bowl with all of the vegetables, mix it all up, and then I put it into a baking dish with baking paper or parchment paper, as some people call it. And that bakes in the oven depending on whatever temperature I need with the other things that I'm cooking. So I don't have any kind of hard and fast rule, but I would guess that it would be something like 200 Celsius, 400 Fahrenheit for 30 to 40 minutes, something like that. And you won't necessarily end up with a firm quiche. You might end up with like something that's a bit drier, more liquidy, because the vegetables are releasing a ton of water. And I'm totally okay with that. That's totally fine by me. I used to be upset that I couldn't make these like perfect pieces, and actually people didn't seem to care. They liked the taste. So there you go. So that's to give you an idea of what I do at a festive meal. And then we always have dessert. Usually I ask my guests to bring dessert because after cooking all that food, I don't really feel like cooking much more. But I'll give you a dessert recipe that I happen to like, that I think the crust, I kind of made it up myself. So here you go. Into the blender or food processor, you take 2 parts dates, 1 part pecan, and 1 part coconut flour. Coconut flour is not shredded coconut, and it's not coconut sugar. It's coconut flour, if you can get it. If not, you could probably just use regular flour. I think that would go okay. And you pulse it in the blender or in the food processor until you end up with everything kind of broken up. And then you put that at the bottom of a pie dish and just kind of stick it into the pie dish. And then you take whatever fruits are in season. So I actually happen to have nectarines and grapes and apples in my kitchen. So that's probably what I'm going to make my pie with this weekend. And I cut them up into little cubes, put in a little bit of maple syrup and some cinnamon and some vanilla. And my secret ingredient, rose water, because it tastes like roses and it's amazing and it's so fragrant and I love it. Mix that all up, throw it into the pie dish and bake it. Or you can have it raw, because that crust, unless you're using regular flour, that crust doesn't need any cooking whatsoever. And it's so yummy. I love it. So hopefully I've given you guys something to work with. And if you have any questions, please send them my way. You can contact me directly on my website, or you can put questions in the comments next week. And for those of you in the midst of Jewish holiday season, I wish you a festive season with so much renewal and excitement and enthusiasm and joy and connection with yourself, with the divine, and with the people you love. And for everyone else, I guess the same thing, because life is just so good, and that you should eat food that nourishes you, mind, body, and soul. Take care.